Debates Patreon Project presents Reflections on my conversation with Dr. Jordan Peterson. Hey, so here we are at the end of April 2018, and a few weeks ago I was in Toronto and did a sit-down conversation, a sort of head-to-head with Dr. Jordan Peterson. We'd never met before this, and while I was familiar with some of the news stories about him, I wasn't all that familiar with him. I haven't read his books. And I thought that that would be a really good way to go into the conversation. Now, you can go watch this event. It's currently available as I make this recording at Pangburn Philosophy's Patreon channel. You can watch it and listen to it. It may be the case that the entire video is available for free to everyone. At a minimum, I hope to make the audio of this event available because I thoroughly enjoyed it and am pretty proud of what happened. Conversations in these matters can often be incredibly frustrating. This happens whether I'm in a debate with an apologist or whether I'm just sitting down having a discussion with someone who has views that are dramatically different from mine and language styles that seem to be confusing. Going into the debate, or going into this discussion, I knew that he had made a fuss about a hate crime law in Canada that was supposedly going to stop or force him to use pronouns and put his job at risk. It turns out that the legal experts say that he was wrong about what the effect of the law was. But that had been addressed many, many times, and I didn't want to necessarily go down that route. I had planned a couple of questions related to pronouns, specifically with his refusal to use ze and zer, the gender-neutral pronouns that are trying to gain some traction, because I wasn't quite sure what his position was. Was it that he absolutely refused to use these because they're made-up words, in which case you could just point out that all words are made up and that language morphs and changes, and that as we have need for new terms to describe concepts as the concepts change, that it might make sense to come up with new words. On the other hand, I fully agree with him. The government shouldn't be able to force you to use particular pronouns or language, etc., except that wasn't what the government was going to do. And so he got incredibly popular for something that wasn't even real. And I remember around the time this was happening, we were both at the Chan Center in Vancouver on the same night, and he was in a side room with, like a 75-person capacity, and I was out in the big room, and that dynamic completely flipped. So there were people who were saying, oh, why are you platforming Jordan Peterson? Well, he's incredibly popular. If anything, he's platforming me at this point, and I'm a fan of challenging ideas. If there's somebody who's promoting a particular idea, a thought process, a concept that you have an objection to, the best thing you can do is to make sure you have that discussion with them if possible, to let them explain themselves, and then point out what you object to about it. So the short version of what happened is I walked out on stage, and I had seen the Channel 4 interview with Jordan Peterson, where the woman who was doing the interview clearly did not like him, clearly had an agenda. And during the conversation, he would say something, and then she would say, so what you're saying is, and this is essentially an attempt to strawman somebody. It's not good mirroring, which is, if I understand you correctly, you're saying this, or am I correct in assuming? Those are questions that are seeking clarification. So what you're saying is quite often an attempt to strawman, if in fact you get it wrong. And in that conversation, all it did was allow Dr. Peterson to explain again, or in a different way, or go off on a tangent. And so he just got to talk more. The actual merits of the ideas he was expressing didn't really get challenged. And so I walked out on stage and I said, I just met him an hour or so ago at dinner. We haven't had much time for conversation. I'm not going to do what the Channel 4 interviewer did. I am not going to be attempting to strawman him at all. My goal is to have a good conversation, to find out where we agree, where we disagree, and to be open and honest. And when we disagree on something, I'm going to challenge it. And when he says something they don't understand, I'm not going to, so what you're saying is, go down the strawman route. I'm going to ask for clarification. Maybe I don't understand that. Can you dig a bit further? That was the plan for the evening. And I think, I usually leave my events a little disappointed. Oh, I could have done this. Oh, I should have said this. I was not the slightest bit disappointed at the end of this event. Of course, there were things that could be improved. I actually wouldn't mind having other conversations with him. But I accomplished what I wanted to do on many fronts. And so I'm going to give you some summaries of things that he said and what my view of my reaction to that was. And then, when it's either you can go to the Patreon and check it out, or maybe it'll be released at a later date. You can see for yourself whether or not what you think of the event and whether or not I'm fairly representing it. So what kind of things did we talk about? So I came out to the backyard to film this. So there's a trampoline behind me because many people view these sorts of conversations as if you're on a trampoline because you're really not getting anywhere. I don't view it that way. I think some people kind of dismiss the value of having a trampoline. It's good exercise. It's a bit of fun, and you do make some progress. It's just not a way of getting from point A to point B. In this particular discussion, I knew that I wanted to talk to him more about his thoughts on God and gods, including in the narrative sense, and also about morality. He'd previously been on Sam Harris's podcast twice. The first time was this disaster where they couldn't even agree on truth because Sam was viewing truth as that which is consistent with reality, and Peterson was advocating for a sort of metaphorical truth. It's true if it benefits you in some way. And you can listen to Sam Harris's Waking Up podcast with him, where I think Sam did a good job of addressing that. But I didn't want to spend all the time going in circles on the subject of truth. And so I wanted to have a conversation about gods and morality. And there were questions that came up during the Q&A, which I think were better than some of what we addressed. One interesting one I thought I'd put at the outset was somebody essentially asked, if every thinking mind ceased to exist, would God still exist? Now, I've seen Jordan being asked before, situation when he's asked, it's a hemming and hawing, it's a dancing around, and that's a difficult thing to address, and it's made him difficult to be pinned down on these sorts of things, which is why I wanted to discuss them. And so when somebody asked, if they would have asked me when I was a Christian, if every thinking mind ceased to exist, would God still exist? The answer is yes. God's always existed. God's eternal. God is not contingent upon human minds. For Dr. Peterson, it was a little bit of a different story. That's a very difficult question, and let's go back and look at, the Enlightenment and this notion of materialism, and people thought that, if we all disappeared, that, this table would still be this table and this rock would still be this rock, etc. But he's not so sure about that because, he wants to consider the impact the observer has and the narrative that we write about it. And I didn't actually address that response there. I can do it here. That's garbage as far as I'm concerned. It violates Occam's razor. It violates the null hypothesis. It violates the burden of proof. It violates the foundations of skepticism. And that to me is incredibly important because as far as I can tell, if every thinking mind ceases to exist, there's no reason to think that has any impact on this camera and this tripod, that it stops being what it is. Certainly there are no longer people to recognize what it is. It's not going to be performing in its function. There's not going to be anybody here to record or edit anything. But there's no reason to think that the camera changes what it is or that it ceases to exist. And if you think that that's likely to be the case, you have to actually meet a burden of proof with respect to that claim. You've adopted a view that this is like something that is likely to happen or might happen, and you have to demonstrate that. You can't just go down to, we as observers interact. This notion of, it's true for me, is something that I've rejected forever. And standing in line answering questions after the event, there was a woman who came up and said, oh, so you don't think there's an afterlife? And I said, no, I have no reason to think that there is. If there is one, somebody can demonstrate it and we'll find out afterwards. And she's like, well, there is, and I know, and you would know if you were, I forget the exact word she used, but, an intuitive, that's the word she used. She thinks she's intuitive and can intuit these things. And so she doesn't have a good grounding in skepticism. Now, I'm going to do a video probably later on today or tomorrow that talks about my magic and skepticism tour. This was part of that tour, even though I didn't do the show here. And I really think that Jordan and others could have benefited from that tour because it's about the foundations of skepticism. At one point during the conversation, and this is one of the regrets that I have that I didn't actually address this, he sort of mocked or sneered the word something about skeptics and skepticism under his breath. And I really, really wish that I would have addressed that. It's probably the biggest regret of the evening because it ties in so well with the purpose of this broader tour to teach the basics of skepticism. And I think I didn't address it because I didn't want us to go back and forth on too many things. We were already talking about God and morality. But I think also a lot of people caught it. It was a very skeptics or skepticism or something like that, or this is what you get when you get skeptics involved. It was a sneering dismissal. And it's sad because when you consider most of the other things that he said, skepticism would really be something that is beneficial to him just as it is to everybody else. It's just that people think skepticism is something it's not. It's about attempting to confirm. It's about withholding belief until belief's warranted. So let's take a look at some of the claims that he made that I think could have benefited from a healthy dose of skepticism. So fairly early on in the conversation, he talked about mystical experiences, people who would take drugs and have mystical experiences. And the skeptic in me immediately wanted to point out, and did point out, that I'm happy to believe that people are having experiences that they call mystical, but that doesn't mean that they are mystical. In much the same way that if somebody says, I saw a ghost, it doesn't mean they saw a ghost. I'm happy to believe that they saw something that they are referring to as a ghost, as a disembodied spirit of a person. But the fact that they're using that language and making that claim isn't itself enough to confirm it. And so we had a back and forth. You talk about the consistency of these experiences. People take DMT or these other drugs and they induce a mystical or supernatural experience. And I had to keep saying that's the language that people use to describe them, perhaps because we don't have better language for it. And that may be the case that they are mystical or supernatural, but we need to actually demonstrate that. You don't just get high and say you've seen God and that's the end of it. He claimed that you couldn't quit smoking without having a mystical experience. Not that it was more likely or more probable, or you couldn't do it unless you'd had an experience that you kind of identified as mystical. He seemed to be going right down the road of you can't quit smoking unless you have a mystical experience. Now, I can't demonstrate that he's wrong, other than I quit smoking 10 or 11 years ago. I haven't had a cigarette in 10 or 11 years, didn't have any mystical experience. I don't know what his real response to that would be, because when I pushed back on it, he wanted to go down this road of, oh, we know this is the case, and let's cite this, and let's cite that. And there didn't seem to be a strong tie to a consideration of the reality that you and I experience, as far as I can tell. So that was one of the first things. You can't quit smoking without God or shrooms, essentially. I don't know how he got there. It seems to be one of these things of when you show that people have a particular type of experience and it can be life-changing, it's one thing to say that can be beneficial to them. I spent a good portion of the night talking about a number of things that I thought could be beneficial. When we talked about whether or not there was a God, one of the questions that I had thought of ahead of time to ask, and I did ask, is, what are you afraid that we'll lose if people stop believing in a God? Because I get the feeling that sometimes, a la Dan Dennett, what Peterson is doing is not so much believing in a God, but he's believing in belief. He's valuing the idea that if we believe these things, there's benefits. And as I said on that evening, I'm happy to acknowledge that you can inspire people, that you can educate people, that you can change people's lives and behaviors with compelling narratives. But that is independent of whether those narratives point to something that is true. I can get you to change your behavior through re-education, through recognition of empathy, through story I'm using to influence you is ultimately true. And so when I asked him what he was afraid of losing, it took a while, but we got around to he's afraid we'll lose these grand narratives, the metaphorical substrate that underlies these narratives. And that's really not an answer, because until you tell me what there is of value within the narrative, I've basically asked, if you no longer believe these narratives, what will you lose? And his answer is the narratives. Well, I want to know, what is it about the narratives that are valuable? And also, why you think we're going to lose them? Yes, there are probably still people who believe in, the Greek and Roman pantheon of gods to some extent, whether or not they actually think that they're literal beings, whatever. But we haven't lost those narratives. We haven't lost those stories. And we're not stopping in our effort to create new stories. There's 5 superhero movies coming out in the near future. All of those are the same sort of grand narrative, the Christ-type figures, the heroic figures, the things you would read about when Joseph Campbell puts together his discussion about the narrative. I value some of these narratives because they're allegories and homilies and things that lead us to realizations about who we are. But the stories themselves aren't true, and I want to get to the point where we can at least acknowledge that. If Peterson said, I don't think any of that stuff is true, I just think that there's some cool stories in there that we can learn from, we don't have that much of a disagreement. The problem is that you have fundamentalists and evangelicals running around who actually believe that these aren't just narratives, that they are in fact true. So he didn't really explain too much about what we would lose from those narratives. But what he did say essentially is that not only can you not quit smoking without a God, but if you lose that belief, what you also lose, according to him, is art. And I push back on this as well. Are you telling me there's no atheist artists, that there's no godless heathen rock musicians? Hell, I can write a poem for you right now. This is something that stems from who we are. And some people are more adept at it. Some people are more adept at telling a story. Some people are more adept at speaking in public. Some are better at performing, at acting out roles. We're telling stories, painting pictures, and writing music, creating beautiful art all the time without any need for either the belief in a religion or the truth of a religion, as far as we can tell. And when you conflate those two things, the belief in a religion and the truth of a religion, that's where you run into problems. This claim about not being able to quit smoking, I think, could use a healthy dose of skepticism. This claim about the value of a narrative or the fact that we might lose it if people stop believing in it is almost demonstrably false. We talked a little bit about foundations of morality, and this is where we ran into probably one of the most telling moments of the night, because I wanted to have a good conversation. I wanted to make sure I wasn't treating him unfairly, that I didn't straw man him, that I never did the "so what you're saying is." And I think that I sat there fairly calmly, let him speak. We both interrupted each other on occasion. That just is going to happen. But there was a moment where he was trying to get me to explain foundations of a secular morality, and I was interrupted over and over and over again, many times, to the point where I said, hey, I'm trying to answer the question that you're interjecting with, if you'd just let me finish. And when I talked about one avenue by which you could build a secular moral system, to begin with, let's say, 3 foundational premises, and they can be completely arbitrary. That life is generally preferable to death. These aren't absolute rules; they're general foundations. Health is preferable to sickness, and all this. I kid you not, he interrupted to say, "So you're saying you're not skeptical of those foundations?" Or he said something like, "But you're not skeptical of those foundations." Essentially, he was doing to me exactly what the reporter on Channel 4 did to him, right in the middle of my explanation of those foundations. And I was going to point out that, yes, in fact, you should be skeptical of them, that the value of these things is that you can change them when evidence suggests that they might be wrong. If you started with a foundation of death is preferable to life, you don't get very far because people start dying off. And you realize this is in conflict with well-being. Well-being, and he wants to dismiss that. But he literally strawmanned me. Not necessarily word for word like the Channel 4 person, but it was, so you're not skeptical of those foundations. So after several interruptions and then this attempted straw manning, I did kind of get to shut him down and actually explain what I was talking about. And later on in the night, I used, the sort of chess analogy to, I believe, respond a little bit more in detail to one of the attendees who had a question about the foundations of morality. So that largely worked out pretty good. But his view was that you can't be moral without a God. He was asked during the Q&A, essentially, what would an atheist actually be like? And he gave a reference to a character in, I think, Crime and Punishment, but essentially argued that a true atheist would be a murderer. A true atheist would, be this, I guess, almost Vulcan-like creature of logic. Hey, there's a narrative, Star Trek, that would rationalize and commit murders. And yet he doesn't think that any of the atheists he's encountered, I guess, including me and others, are actually atheists. We have some God. We've made some deity of something in order to keep us from being atheists, who are nihilists and murderers, etc. This take on morality, as I pointed out, I went on a little minor rant there during the Q&A because I would expect this from standard apologists. What we have here is the narrative that atheists can't be moral, that a godless world can't have any foundation of morals, even after one was described to him, even after one that was described which could ultimately be entirely selfish, in the sense that I want to live and I want to live a good life, and so it's in my best interest to make sure that I'm engaging in the sort of thought and encouraging the sort of thought that allows that to happen. That, hey, I don't want my stuff stolen, so I get around a bunch of other people who don't want their stuff stolen, and together we build a society that discourages and punishes, in some cases, But he also doesn't believe you're an atheist. So not only has he failed all night long on everything related to skepticism, including sneering at skepticism in a derogatory sense, not only does he set aside reality-based information in favor of a metaphorical substrate and the significance of a narrative, but he also has bought into this idea that you can't be moral without a God. So a true atheist would just be immoral, would run around killing people. But because you don't do that, and that would conflict with what I believe a true atheist is, I have to now come up with a post hoc rationalization, which is, you're not actually an atheist. And before we did this event, there were a number of people who were like, oh, I really wish you'd sit down with Jordan Peterson. I really love what he has to say. And I kept saying, what is it you love? What is it that he said that you love? And I didn't get very many answers. There were certainly some people who agreed with a couple of political views, and that's fine. But I was hearing from a lot of atheists. He has a lot of atheist fans. And I was like, okay, you're basically telling me that you have a great appreciation for somebody who seems to identify as a Christian and has been referred to as the Deepak Chopra of Christianity, because when he's asked about this stuff, you get kind of word soup quite often with let's set aside reality and appeal to these grand narratives and metaphorical substrates when we're talking about reality. Either there is a God or there isn't. That's it. Either we have good reason to believe there's a God or we don't. That's it. That is separate from whether or not, hey, there's this really compelling God story that provides people with hope or encourages them to be better people. That may well be true. My first concern is whether or not there's a God. Because if there's not, then that story, which has that effect on people, implies that there are other stories that might have that effect, and it may be the case that you can have that same effect with something that is true by having a good understanding of the fact that we are creatures sharing space, and that my actions have consequences on other people, their actions have consequences on me, and that we should work reasonably to try to make sure that we minimize the harm that we can do each other and maximize the benefit that we can provide to each other without appealing to the supernatural, without relying on deities, and without relying on fairy tales. You look at Grimm's fairy tales and the nursery rhymes we tell kids, these are morality plays. But largely, people don't think that they point to something true. They're not like the characters in the story are true. The thing that they're pointing to as true is something about us. And I would hope that a psychologist would actually start to recognize this. And I have some concerns about a psychologist. Granted, he's working as a professor. I don't know that he has actual patients. But if somebody comes to you and tells you that they believe they're George Washington, and your view of truth is that it's true if it benefits you, then how do you diagnose them? How do you determine that they're not George Washington? Do you just say, oh, it doesn't matter, they're getting a benefit out of it? Without having a sound foundation on the reality we supposedly share and experience, I don't know how you could do your job as a psychologist. To me, it's almost as if a good understanding, which I think he has, of human psychology has led him down a road where the narratives that make up our lives and the interactions we have on almost more of a sociological level trump anything about reality. And I don't know how you can really do psychology well that way. But I'm not a psychologist, and I would be interested in other psychologists' musings on how to reconcile this potential thing. So one last thing to hit, and then we'll be moving on to other things. So I've talked a lot about what was said there from my perspective. Obviously, you should watch it, make up your own mind. If it's not available currently, it may be in the future, as I mentioned. But there was a lot of frustration, and it wasn't primarily from me. I was really interested in having a conversation. I wanted us each to share our ideas, get the contrast out there. There was a lot more interrupting and strawmanning coming from Jordan. And despite that, and despite my confusion over his fascination with narratives, I would have another conversation with him and maybe broach some other topics and find other areas where we disagree. There are people who, why would you ever engage with Jordan Peterson? Well, because I can actually have a conversation, and if I think that some of his ideas are wrong and potentially dangerous, I think the way to expose them is to get him to say what those ideas are and then express the difference. That doesn't mean that every conversation with somebody you agree with is going to be valuable, but the guy's incredibly popular. The notion, though, of not being able to quit smoking without some sort of mystical experience, this claim about drugs leading to mystical experiences, that's something I hear a lot. It's even something that I've spoken to Sam Harris about a little bit. I don't think that Sam comes anywhere near making the claim that people are having mystical experiences in the same sense that Jordan was. But sometimes we don't have better language to use to describe that, which is why I was trying to go down that route. But at the end of the night, I ended with a story which I'll relay here. And it won't be word for word, but it is a true story. And it's important. As I said earlier, I'm happy to believe that people have had experiences that they describe as mystical. I just don't think that we have evidence that those experiences are in fact mystical. I've taken hallucinogens. Once upon a time on LSD, I was sitting in a bathroom, staring at the door for the bathroom, and it was a wood grain door. And wood grain, for those of you who have had hallucinogenic experiences, really good for visual effects. And there was a spot on the door that was shaped a little bit like a strawberry. And as I stared at it, the strawberry gained a face, and it gained a big Superman S on its chest and a cape. And it smiled, and it started to move around, and then it flew off the door and did a lap around my head and smacked into the door, becoming wood frame again. A fairly short experience, but really cool, for that sort of trippy, hallucinogenic type experience. And at no point during that experience or after did I ever reach the conclusion that there's some other realm full of super strawberries from this super strawberry. And if it had spoken to me and relayed a message, I wouldn't in any way think that that message somehow tied to something true and valuable, other than if this is generated by my mind, perhaps I'm, sitting here contemplating something and my subconscious mind is trying to give me information. What if a whole bunch of other people started having those same experiences and reporting super strawberries? Would that mean that we've discovered a way to tap into the super strawberry realm and we should start paying attention to it because these super strawberries are going to tell us how to live and enjoy life and have a better future? No. In much the same way that alien abduction stories back in the 40s and 50s, or even before that, when you had encounters with aliens, they were varied and different. And then after, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the narrative about what kind of aliens we were encountering became very, very similar, to the point where almost everybody universally is describing the almond head and the eyes and, gray with black eyes and large heads and stuff. It may make sense from a scientific perspective. It may be very common, but once the stories have entered the public narrative, you can no longer have confidence that somebody who's reporting, I experienced an alien that looked like this, that they are reporting accurately what they experienced or whether or not their experience was likely to be true. You don't get to say all these people are experiencing the same sort of thing, therefore there must be something there. Because the something that might be there influencing the sort of experiences they have is the narrative, is the story that has been cultivated through who we are. We are similar people with similar minds, addressing similar issues, trying to solve similar problems. How could it remotely be surprising that we come up with similar explanations? And if you read through the work of Joseph Campbell and others, when we talk about mythical figures and heroic figures and Christ figures and saviors and things like this, they appear all over the place. And there are people who look at that and say, there's so much commonality that there must be something there. It must point to something true. And yet they don't want to acknowledge that the thing it seems most likely to point to that's true is that human beings tell stories, and the stories are going to be similar. We're pattern recognition machines. We look for agency when we see a bush move. Is it the bush moving or is it something in the bush? And sometimes we infer agency. When we are standing there talking to somebody and that person falls over dead, it seems intuitively correct that something that was there is not. And so we anthropomorphize those things and we tell ghost stories. If in fact there were real ghosts, real gods, real super strawberries, that's something that would need to be demonstrated. And I'm not remotely saying that the stories about those things have no value. I've acknowledged that over and over again in this video, on the stage, at other times. My concern is whether or not they're true, because there's a good contingent of the population that believe they actually are true. And when people who don't believe they're true still find them useful and want to delve into deep philosophical and theological, sociological, even psychological justifications for them, they're talking about two different things. They're not talking about the God people believe in. They're talking about the human condition and what kind of gods we might invent in order to help us better understand ourselves. And that's the language that they need to use to describe that. Instead of saying people have mystical experiences, you should say people have experiences they describe as mystical. Instead of scoffing at skeptics, you should perhaps understand and know what skepticism is. You should also have a better understanding of what atheist means, who atheists are. And the last thing that I want to touch on, because it was the only thing in the evening that actually came close to pissing me off, is I was talking about morality and talking about how we haven't yet had a society where secular humanism was the foundation, so that we could see how well secular humanism could do in comparison to other things. And this is where Dr. Peterson demonstrated the most ignorance. And that was when he said that, oh yes, we have Soviet Russia, Stalinist Russia. Well, you can call that an atheistic regime, but the truth is, it was religious in its structure. It was a state religion that banned, Christianity and other things like that, but the state was the power, and the man was the power, and the cult of personality. There's nothing about Soviet Russia that could fairly be considered as secular humanism. And so I flat out told him on stage that this was monumentally ignorant, and that before he goes around declaring that there was a secular humanist regime that killed its citizens and did these other things, that he should take some time to learn what secular humanism is, to read the various secular humanist manifestos, and perhaps to even talk to some secular humanists. Because you can't point to a value in secular humanism that necessarily leads to the sort of problems that we saw in that, albeit atheistic regime, that Soviet Russian regime, and others like it. He does not know what secular humanism is. And because of this, it keeps him mired in the idea that you just couldn't have a moral system. And if I were a psychologist analyzing what was happening on stage, my guess is that that would be why I was interrupted so frequently and so often and strawmanned right when I was trying to explain how it is possible to have a secular moral system, with secular humanism being a prime example of what we're trying to do with that. But I'm not a psychologist, so maybe it's not fair for me to psychoanalyze him, but you can watch the video for yourself. I enjoyed it. I hope there's a chance to do more, and hopefully it did some good. I got lots of great feedback from people on this. There were a couple people who gave some incredibly negative feedback on it, but they seem to be in the extreme minority. So I'm hoping everybody gets to see it, particularly Jordan's fans, and in particular Jordan's atheist fans, Because as I said on stage that night, the bad news is that he thinks atheists are going to be murderers. The good news is that he doesn't actually think you're an atheist. So while I run around pretending that I can read minds on stage, knowing that I can't and portraying it as entertainment, Jordan evidently seems to think that he can read minds, and he can't.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.